I'm actually not going to jump all the way ahead to 30. I'm going to add something that Swami Kriyanandaji said that he heard from the Shankaracharya of Govardhan Math, who told him that he had some documents. And one of them was one of 3 copies of this discussion between the early church fathers who said that what do we do about these missing years when Christ was in India, because just like Shurja was saying. And in that document it said that Christ was in Puri also, and that he was teaching to everybody there. He was very magnetic, and that the Brahmin priests didn't like that he was also preaching to lower caste people, and they threw him out of Puri. But it's very interesting that Yogananda spent time in Puri, Sri Yukteswarji spent time in Puri. And Swami Kriyananda, he always felt inside that Yogananda was an incarnation of Christ, of Jesus Christ. And when you look at the 3 wise men showing up there, there was Sri Yukteswarji, there was Babaji, there was Lahiri Mahashai. Where was Yogananda in that picture? There was only room for one place that he could have been, which was this baby Christ. And there are some interesting parallels. And finally, one time, Swami Kriyanandaji asked Yoganandaji, just point blank, are you an incarnation of Jesus? You know what his answer was? He didn't answer. He just said, he kind of just, it's all one. We're all, what difference would it make? Meaning, yeah, we're all the same and it doesn't matter. And Swamiji later in his life, there's a talk that he gave on a Christmas, one of the last Christmases. He gave a talk where he expressed his much stronger conviction that indeed Yogananda was an incarnation of Jesus Christ. So those missing years, he was in India, he was teaching, he was learning, he was being with the yogis, and then he went back to Israel and to his homeland. And it was only at the age of 30 that he finally actually started his ministry and his teaching in his homeland. And he only had 3.5 years of that. The rest of his public life, of which the Gospels describe, it's entirely just about a very short period in his life of a few years. And so he came back, and the first sort of, and I'll just go over some of the story of his life, and then also come back and just touch on perhaps a few of the stories that are especially notable. And this won't cover all the stories. And this afternoon we'll also touch on some stories and teachings that he gave more from an inward sense. But the first notable thing was that he got baptized by John the Baptist, who was prophesied to be the one who was going to baptize him. And Yoganandaji said that in a previous life, John the Baptist was his guru, and they had this guru-disciple relationship. And he said who they were. These, who were they in the?
Elijah and Eliseus.
Eliseus, yeah. Elijah and Eliseus. I always get all these names mixed up, even though I was brought up with this. So they came back to fulfill the prophecy, and John the Baptist baptized Jesus, and that was his official beginning as the Messiah. Now, the Messiah of the Jews was predicted in all the Jewish prophecies that there would be a Messiah coming. And so the Jews were always waiting for the Messiah, the Christ. And now the prophecies were starting to be fulfilled by Jesus, which, as you'll see, made him extremely unpopular with the Jewish priests and the high priests and the Romans also. And so he was baptized by John the Baptist and immediately recognized, this dove descended on him, and he was immediately recognized by John the Baptist as the Son of God, as the Christ. And very soon after that, John the Baptist, who had disciples himself, he was with a few of his disciples. Christ walked by, and John the Baptist pointed to Christ and said, "This is the Lamb of God." And those disciples, 2 or 3, immediately became Christ's disciples. It doesn't give the whole story, but I presume that John the Baptist said, "You follow him now, my work is done, and he is the Christ." One presumes that they didn't leave their guru and follow somebody else. And so this is really where Christ's work began. And his work was so much about his disciples. In some way, we don't have time to get into this, but in some way, so much of his story is the story of his disciples, who really brought Christ's teachings out, because Christ only had 3.5 years. And not just the 12 apostles, who are given a lot of emphasis, but he had other disciples. Mary Magdalene, who I think maybe in some ways was his closest disciple, who really understood Christ more deeply. And Narayani will talk about how she was the one who discovered Christ at the resurrection, and it was her intuition and heart and deeper attunement, perhaps, than the others of the inner Christ that came back and found him. And there was householder disciples, there was other women disciples, there was a whole band of disciples who followed him around. And some of even among the apostles, some of the least known ones, were in some ways, in fact, his most beloved disciple was named John. And he was one of the 12 apostles, but he wasn't the famous one who, like Peter, who was in all the stories and who became sort of their leader after Christ left. And so in some ways, it's also about guru-disciple relationship in a very deep way. And Judas also was one of his disciples. And it's just so interesting, this whole drama in this story. It's also some parallels to Krishna that this is my own personal belief, that Judas, who betrayed Christ, and those who killed Christ, when you read the story of Krishna too, there were people who tried to kill him. And in most of those stories, the ones who tried to kill him were actually really advanced souls who wanted the darshan of the Lord Krishna and to be killed by Krishna so that they could be liberated and freed from all karma. Isn't that strange? Here were people who were supposedly evil trying to kill Krishna. And I personally think that those who came even opposed to Christ had a good karma to have such a deep connection. But they were just playing a role that needed to be fulfilled. And on the astral plane, maybe the first 12 apostles' roles were filled, and Jesus said, well, there's one more. It's this guy who's going to betray me. And if I was sitting there, I'd say, okay, I'll do it. Just really, seriously, and in fact, about Judas, Master said that Judas was liberated under Ramakrishna as a disciple of Ramakrishna. And Master knew him and met him in that lifetime. And so there's so much of this drama that is outward, that's these stories, but there's also so much that's hidden. And that really so much of the life of Christ is the more inward, which we will talk more about this afternoon. And so Jesus gathered his disciples. Some of them were attracted to him because of miracles he performed. He performed a lot of miracles in his life. And then one sort of really significant moment it's what's called the transfiguration of Christ. And he went up to a mountaintop with 3 of his close disciples, 3 of the apostles. And he went up there just, I think, for solitude. And while he was there, all of a sudden this light from heaven came down upon him, and he was filled with light. And at the very same time, 2 of the prophets who were part of the prophecy of the Messiah descended. This was Moses and Elijah descended in form, and the 3 apostles saw this happening. So much so that I think it was Peter went to go get 3 tents to house Christ, Moses, and Elijah. I mean, that's how real they were in this vision. And Christ said, no, come on, you don't have to do that. And because very soon Moses and Elijah went back up into the light. And this voice of God, the direct voice of God, came down and said about Christ, this is my son in whom I am well pleased. And so this was kind of the coming out of party of Christ. The thing is that the disciples, Christ told those 3 disciples, don't talk about this until after I leave the body. And so the story was not publicly known, but presumably maybe the rest of his disciples knew about this. Swami Kriyananda has this beautiful, it's called the oratorio, Christ Lives, about Christ's life. And there's a beautiful song by Swamiji about this transfiguration when God descended and the prophets descended and God anointed Christ. And we'll play this song here right now.
is my Son, in whom I am well pleased. Naught of himself remains, naught but the true light. Heed well his words, the way he shows is my way. All who would find the truth walk where he leads.
So that was the beginning of Christ coming out, and he started preaching, he started performing miracles. He went to a wedding, a very famous story as he went to this wedding in the land of Cana, and they ran out of wine for the feast, and he performed this miracle of turning water into wine. And it's very similar to a miracle that apparently Yogananda ji performed. He also, one time there was a feast, and there was not enough bread and fish for everyone to eat, and Christ blessed the bread and the fish, and they started passing these, just a few baskets with hordes of people, because huge crowds started coming to him because of his magnetism. Master's version of this miracle that one of the disciples told, he did it with carrot juice. There was some carrot juice that needed to be shared and passed around, and there wasn't enough, and all of a sudden there was an endless supply of this carrot juice that was there. And so these huge crowds started coming to be around Christ. They started hearing of miracles. He healed many people. There's just many, many stories in the Bible about Christ healing people of leprosy, of blindness, all these different miracles that happened. Perhaps the most famous one, which I'll get into a bit later, is when he raised Lazarus from the dead, who was dead for 4 days, and in the tomb, buried, gone, and he raised him from the dead. And so he started getting very well known. He started traveling around different parts of there. And I'll just touch on a few sort of stories of him. And one of them is something that Swami Kriyananda pointed out. He said that Christ, the way that he taught was very natural. It wasn't like the words in the Bible, because of the translation and the language, the words sound sort of ponderous and really serious, and they sound like someone was kind of saying them with a really deep voice from the end of a long tunnel or something. And you actually see some modern spiritual teachers who speak this way really slowly, as if they were speaking from the infinite, from God, and long pauses, and they go like that. And Christ was very natural, a sense of humor. His disciples would laugh. And he also had a real sense of humor. Just some of the things that he said in passing were very funny. There was this group called the Pharisees who were very ostentatious. And when they would donate money to the temple, they would have a big parade and trumpets blaring just to show how much money they were donating and just to make a big show of how much they were donating. And Christ just very wryly said when someone asked him about this, he said, "Verily, they too shall have their reward." And he didn't say what their reward was going to be. He was talking about karma, and what is the karma for being so proud and arrogant and, looking around at what everyone is thinking of you. And his teachings were all in very natural contexts. He did also give sort of long discourses in very remote settings sometimes on the mountaintop, including the Beatitudes and the Sermon on the Mount. But much of it was just in regular human conduct that he was teaching his disciples. And to me, that's the big story of what it's like to be with a master as he teaches. There's just all these different incidences that are sort of teaching moments. And one of them, for example, is the disciple Mary Magdalene, who just was a bhakti yogi in a very deep way, was very devotional. And as Christ was visiting, I think, her family home, she took this very, very expensive oil and started anointing and massaging Christ's feet with this oil. And Judas, I believe it was, who had issues about money, and he was, in some ways, some people see him, I don't know that this is really true, but as sort of as a wanting social upliftment only and political change, and thinking that Christ, prophesied as King of the Jews, was going to be a political king that changed the society more than inward religion. And he started judging Mary and scolding her, and just Christ just said, "The poor you shall always have with you. Me you shall not always have with you." And he was saying that Mary was doing the right thing by worshiping with deep devotion, the light of God come into this human form. Another time, Mary, again, a story about her. She was there, Christ was teaching, I think, in the home again, and she was just sitting there meditating and absorbing his vibrations. And Martha, her sister, who was more, say, a karma yogi, but I think she was just being restless. She was running around making food and doing all these things which needed to be done. And she was starting to get a little bit irked that her sister was just sitting there at Christ's feet, absorbing all these good vibrations, and she was having to do all the work. And she took it upon herself to do it. No one asked her to do it, I don't think. And Christ also scolded her and said that what Mary was doing was the higher business that needed to get done. So his teachings were all very natural, in context, and clear, beautiful, deep. Now, one of the trends that was coming through all this is that the Jewish religion at that time and why they needed a Messiah, and Yoganandaji has pointed this out at times, and Swamiji, that a new avatar comes because there's a need partly for the evolution of the age, but also the old teachings start to get too rigid, too form-bound, and just too dogmatic, and maybe the priests, you'll see the priests at this time, start to become not realized people, but they become people who are just want power in this example. But also it was time for a new approach. In the Jewish religion, it was a wrathful God. And you've heard the saying, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, which Mahatma Gandhiji used. And this came from the Jewish Bible. This was their way of spiritual practice. It's all karma. If you sin, you're going to pay the price, and we're going to stone you to death, as we'll see. That was one of the practices. And so Christ came to bring something different. And Gandhiji really tuned into these teachings of Christ. And part of his nonviolence came from going away from this eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. To paraphrase Gandhiji, if the whole world practiced this, then nobody in the world would have any teeth, because tooth for a tooth. And so Christ came to bring grace, truth, and forgiveness, unconditional love. That was a whole new teaching that he was bringing. And the priests of the old religion didn't like it, because I think in some ways they were seeing not the death of their religion, because there's still truth to any great religion that Moses brought, the Jewish religion. But it was time for a refresh. And I think they were seeing that here was a threat to them, and seeing Christ even at the age of 12 going into the temple and correcting even the wisest of those priests, not to mention the ones who were just in it for the money and the power. And so Christ brought something completely different. And there's two stories regarding this. One is that there was a woman who was being judged. Christ came upon her in a village. She, was practicing adultery and had many boyfriends, even though she was married. And the crime, according to the Jewish religion, was that she would be stoned to death. That means people pick up stones and just start throwing them at her in the public square until she dies. Imagine. That's just barbaric, but that was the practice. And so Christ came upon this, and people were starting to pick up stones, and Christ said, "Let he who is without sin throw the first stone." And everybody put their stones back down. and walked out of the square. And that was, in some ways, it was, and then he said to her, he said, "Go and sin no more." And he was saying, your sins are forgiven. Doesn't mean you can keep doing this, but go and sin no more. And as Shurjo pointed out, sin and karma, Yoganandaji had the same attitude, which is that people nowadays in India very often use the word karma pretty equivalent to sin. Something bad happens to me, it's because of my bad karma. But they're saying it's because I sinned in the past. And there's too much identification with karma, with sin. And Christ was saying, this is a new time. This is a new truth. This is a new dispensation of unconditional love and forgiveness. The other story along this line is that he was traveling through a town called Samaria. And there was a very holy site there, Jacob's well. Jacob was an Old Testament prophet, and there was a well there that produced water that people considered it holy. And she was there. And Yoganandaji said something interesting. He said that Christ knew that there was a fallen disciple of his from past lifetimes in Samaria, and that's why he went to Samaria, to this well, because he knew that this woman was there. And she was there and at the well, and Christ went to the well, and they started talking, and this woman was of a different sect and a different faith or part of the country, and it would a caste, I guess you could say, and it was unusual for them to be talking so closely. And she started talking about herself, and Christ started talking to her, and he knew that she had a husband, but she also had many other boyfriends going on and all this, and he knew. And he asked her about it, and she was honest. And the fact that she was open and honest with him, he blessed her for it in a way. And then he said that what he was bringing was not this physical water. It was a new dispensation again. It was the living water of Christ consciousness, of meditation, of inward living, and that was what Christ was to bring. And he taught her this, probably some meditation, I presume. And we'll play this song. That's Swami Kriya.
He who would slake his thirst now and forever, let him not fill his cup here from this well. From living water sipped in the
one other most notable, and in some ways, for many people, the most remembered teaching of Christ was his Sermon on the Mount, where he gathered some of his very close disciples, brought them out there. Yoganandaji and Swamiji taught that this was a time when Christ brought his closest disciples. There's some that say that it was just to a large crowd, but these were the more inner teachings. And I'll talk more about this afternoon, because really what Yoganandaji said is that Christ's teachings were really inward. And Swamiji and Master have pointed out a certain irony, which is that Christ's teachings were all about inner communion. They were about meditation. Master said that Christ taught his disciples Kriya Yoga or technique like it. And Krishna's was more, included that, but was more about right action and included so much about how to live life. And over the centuries, they sort of reversed, and that Christianity became more about right action and, serving the poor and doing things for others. And in India, it was more about meditation and inner communion. And in fact, Yoganandaji said that these two trends and two threads were destined to come together in this day and age. And this is why when Yoganandaji was asked why he came, he said it was to bring original Christianity and original yoga. And he didn't sort of say original Christianity here, original yoga over there. They were one and the same to Yoganandaji. And it was to really bring this recognition back that they were one and the same. And so much of Christ's teachings were inward. It's very interesting, this whole idea of Kriya Yoga by Christians. One note that I'll say is that in more Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox Christianity, there's much more of an inward practice. And just that's been kept alive. And there was a schism between the Eastern Church and the Western Church because of that. And one of their practices, as described, and I've seen people describing this and read about it, is that they have a mantra that they do. And they do this mantra with the breath. And when they breathe, they feel a cool current coming up the left side of the body. And when they exhale, they feel a warm current going down the right side of the body. I won't say any more. If you know Kriya Yoga, you'll know what I'm talking about. And it's just, there is a thread here. And again, you start seeing this connection between Christ and Yogananda in so many ways, and start seeing that, yes. In fact, when Yogananda wrote his interpretations of the scriptures, of the Christian scriptures, it was written in his magazine that he published for about 20 years or 10 years or whatever in installments. And the very issue of the very last installment of that book was when he left the body. And so the second coming of Christ, which is what this series was called, he left another hint for us, I think, that leads to this idea that Yogananda was Christ. The Beatitudes were given in the Sermon on the Mount, and I'll just read them, because even if you're not familiar with them, I think you'll recognize them, and you'll hear some familiarity with them. They're very short. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are they which do hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they shall be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. Blessed are they which are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are ye when men shall revile you and persecute you, and shall say all manner of evil against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice and be exceeding glad, for great is your reward in heaven, for so persecuted they the prophets which were before you. And so this is the inner teachings of Christ. And interestingly, Swami Kriyanandaji wrote a very small booklet based on these Beatitudes, one of the very few things he wrote about Christ. He also wrote this long book called The Revelations of Christ, which really give Christ's inward teachings. So I'll skip ahead a little bit, because there's a lot more to cover. In fact, I'll go right up to when he enters into Jerusalem at the very end of his life. The last week of his life covers about 1/3 of the whole of the Gospels because of everything that happened there, including his crucifixion, his trial, the Last Supper, and most of these things which Narayani will talk about. Just before this, before he went into Jerusalem, on the way there he raised Lazarus from the dead. And Lazarus was dead and buried for 4 days. And he was the brother of the sisters Martha and Mary, his disciples. And they came to Christ and said, "Our brother is dead." And at first they came, "Will you heal him?" And he said, "I'll come." And then he died. And then they came to him again and said, "He's dead." And Christ, very similar to a couple of miracles that Yogananda ji performed, said, "No, I will come." And he performed this miracle, and Lazarus, literally 4 days after being dead and buried, he walked out of the tomb with all the wrappings around him and walked out, and I think some people freaked out seeing the mummy coming out of this tomb, or just because it wasn't like he walked out just, without all this stuff on him. And people were amazed, and Martha and Mary, especially, who had great faith in Christ, I think, understood that he could do this. But it caused a problem. And this was the problem that really was woven through this whole tapestry, which is that from the beginning, Christ knew that he was going to be crucified and persecuted. And so when he raised Lazarus from the dead, the high priests finally realized that this guy has to go because he's just attracting too many people away from us, away from the real church. There's an American comedian who once said that studies show that thousands and millions of people are leaving the church and going back to God, is the way he put it. And I think this is what they were afraid that people were going to leave the church and go back to God. And so this is really, I think, that raising of Lazarus from the dead was kind of the final straw for some of these, according to the Gospels. And so Jesus, he knew all along this was going to happen. He had prophesied it. He knew it. And Swamiji says even Mary, when she had the baby Christ, also knew. And that it was a very bittersweet. The living Christ comes, and we know that people are going to crucify him. And so here's the living Christ bringing all this light, miracles, divine grace, truth, forgiveness, and he's going to be slaughtered. And there's a certain poignancy to knowing that, and Christ knew it too. And he was brought into Jerusalem by his disciples, who finally, the multitudes were proclaiming him as the Messiah. And there was this big parade coming into Jerusalem with Christ. It was a huge celebration among the people because the Messiah has come. Here he is, coming back into Jerusalem. They didn't, most of them, know what was about to happen. Christ knew. They brought him in on a donkey, and this was just the beginning of the last week of his life. They brought into Jerusalem, all these crowds were singing his praises as he came into Jerusalem. He had 1 week there. This is called the Passion Week in Christianity, and many, many events happened during that week. He, again, got into it with the priests and disputing with them. And so the ground was sort of laid for the end of his life, the crucifixion, his betrayal, all these things. And this is something that Narayani will talk about.